Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes. I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler, and today we're talking about
the adjunctification of higher education. And if you heard that word and you're like, what in the hell is that? So it comes from the word adjunct, and we're going to tell you what an adjunct is in just a minute. We don't mean like adjuncts that you put into food products or things like that. We're talking about higher education. And this may come as a big surprise to people who aren't in the business or the racket, as we might call it, of higher education, just how many adjuncts are out there. And, we thought before we get into all the stats and definitions that we should get into, or at least put on the table, why should anyone care about this? So, Dan, you gave some thought to that. What are your views?
So I just see there's definitely two major constituencies here. You have the actual students, and then the population at large. They're going to have different ideas, and just be closer or further. And so definitely if there's, as we'll see, there's not a lot of money that's going to these adjuncts who are teaching a large percentage of these courses. And so if they're not getting paid very well, then where's all the money for the coursework actually going?
Right.
And there's also this worry about what about the quality of the actual instruction? But
we're going to talk about that in a minute. There's good news and bad news, and we'll tell you what that is in just a bit.
And then there's definitely the man on the street, thinking about how we actually try to order our society, that their labor is sold for salary or whatever income that they need. So, but you rather wouldn't have people be exploited for their labor. And if you're a teacher, then you should be spending the most amount of your time either teaching or kind of prepping and doing the things that you need for teaching, and not doing some side gig to pay for the bills. And the last thing is that I was really hoping that you're going to do a little Beastie Boys with this title here, the Adjunctification of Higher Education.
Oh, you want me to rap?
Just one bar.
Yeah, I mean,
but you would.
I don't think I have the meter for it, I mean, if we want to joke around, the meter's running and we got to get to all the other stuff. I don't know. Maybe I'll come up with some good lines later on. But I think going back to the man on the street, or the proverbial Joe or Josephine Blow, as we often say, we can say, well, why should they care about what's happening in higher education? If they've gone to college, great, they're done with it. Or if they didn't go to college and they managed to get work anyway, why be concerned? And I think one answer to that you touched on already is, well, we live in a society, and, a lot of the jobs that people are going to be doing, they do have to get educated. And so we should care about how educational systems, or as we're going to talk about, non-systems, fragmentary systems actually work here in this country. And it's a big political issue too. I mean, if people have been paying any attention, they know that in a lot of red states, there's movements to kind of choke off higher ed in different ways. And, adjunctification isn't necessarily at the heart of that, but some of the things that are side topics like academic freedom fit in there. And, we need an educated workforce in order to have a well-functioning society. So not everybody does care about this issue, but everybody really ought to care at least a little bit about this issue.
Yeah, it's not, a lot of places in this country that you can, go down to the plant right out of high school and just pick up a job that's going to be able to pay you in order to, raise a family anymore.
That's right, yeah.
We live in a very highly educated workforce because the jobs that are now available are mostly knowledge jobs or service jobs, and these things require usually a larger amount of education.
And I'll say something too about trade unions. There's a lot of different kinds of unions, but the ones where you've got skilled workers, and I'll actually tell you a story. I've got an uncle who's just retired from being an iron worker, and he was a drywaller from the time he was 16 years old until about 40 years old. And then, we had that terrible market crash in 2007 and 2008 all across the economy. And his boss decided to no longer provide them with health insurance, and he had a family to support. So he quit, and then his son was in the iron workers. This is down in Indiana, and he joined the iron workers, and the first thing that they did in his apprenticeship was send him to 2 years of college, where you had to study, not only mathematics and you did some hands-on welding stuff, and you had to learn how to write, how to communicate in writing effectively, because that's very important. But you also had to study labor history. And they actually, it's part of your apprenticeship. They paid for that degree. He was scared because he had been, so that would have been at least 20 years since he'd graduated from high school. He had no intention of ever going to college. And he was really worried about that. And I told him, hey, you're going to be fine. You got a good work ethic. You haven't forgotten everything that you learned back then. You're actually a smart guy. You just don't have a degree. And I don't know if he believed me or not, but he got all straight A's. And, after his first semester, I was like, yeah, I'm proud of you, Uncle Scott. Look at, you did it, But notice, even for a blue-collar job, some college is required in a situation like that. A lot of times you can't get a blue-collar job without some sort of academic training, It might be at the community college. It might be a 4-year degree. So even the idea, like you said, I'm just going to go down to the mill with my lunchbox and my overalls and I'll get a job down. No, that's not the way it works anymore, So we should, go ahead.
Oh, I was just, and even if you're talking about the newer manufacturing jobs are, it's not like you getting an impact wrench and, repeatedly going at, adding a new wheel to a car.
Yeah.
The most of that stuff
that
now
is complex. Yeah.
Yeah. Most of that stuff is now done by robots. If anything that can be repeatable has been done to a point that it's going to remove as much labor. And so the whole point is they need you to be able to run complex machines. And you're not going to get that without a little bit of extra work.
Yeah. So coming back to the adjunct thing, we said, what is an adjunct? We'll tell you about that. So it's somebody who is hired to teach classes in a higher education institution. So we're talking about colleges, universities, other things like that. And what makes them an adjunct is that they're not on what we call the tenure track. And a lot of people are really mixed up about this. And the media doesn't help with this because they keep showing college professors in TV shows and movies who are all basically old school tenure track professors. Tenure is something that you get after generally putting in 6 to 7 years, and it gives you like a lifetime security, right? You don't have to be rehired over and over again. You're in. So if you're not on the tenure track, you never have that protection. And in addition to that, as an adjunct, you're ineligible for any real promotion. As a matter of fact, you're not getting what a full-timer who's not on the tenure track would get as far as pay or benefits. And you're hired each semester, or if you're lucky, each year per term and per class to teach. So you're really like a hired gun. You're brought in, and you might do that for 20 years at an institution, but you never have any job security. So the other thing that makes it a little tricky is if you look at different schools, they use different language for this. Some of them will call you an adjunct. At one of the places I teach, I'm actually an adjunct full professor. Which is kind of cool because they have like different ranks, But you're not really a full professor. You're an adjunct. And you might also be called a lecturer or instructor or part-time faculty. And now here's where it gets tricky, right? You could say, oh, well, that's fine because we have a meritocracy. You start out at the bottom, just like any other business, and you work your way up. Well, it's not quite like that in academia. Adjuncts are usually as qualified as the tenure track professors. They're just not getting the same rank and the same benefits and the same security and the same pay as them. Sometimes you can have places where the full-time professors are actually less qualified than the adjuncts. And they're also distinct from other teachers who aren't on the tenure track. So you could be what's called a teaching professor. At Marquette, some of my colleagues are this, and they teach 4 classes per semester, but they are not eligible for tenure or promotion. It's better than being an adjunct in some ways, but you're also still not getting your share of the pie. And now, why do we care about this? I mean, you could say, well, people know what they're getting into. So this goes to something that Dan brought up at the very beginning. Adjuncts over the last 20 years have become a really large proportion of the people who are doing the teaching in most academic institutions. The proportion of them is large already, and it's continually growing. So odds are, if you're taking a college level class and it's not being taught by some graduate assistant, there's a good chance you're actually being taught by an adjunct. And you might not know it because they don't often tell you that. And in some schools, you're actually discouraged from revealing your adjunct status. There are some places here in the greater Milwaukee area where there may be only one full-time person in the department, one person who has tenure, and everybody else is adjuncts.
So let me play devil's advocate here for a moment. Why should we care? Like, why should these professors have extra protections that allow them they don't have to constantly be renewing their contract? Everyone else is constantly on the knife's edge that they can be fired at any point in time. What is the point of this extra protection?
Yeah, it's sort of like saying, well, Wisconsin in general is an at-will state, right? I mean, it's not completely, because if you have a union job, then you're not just at will, right? But when we talk about just about academia, you do want to have continuity, right? You don't want to be necessarily restarting a department every semester, and traditionally tenure has been a way to do that. It also provides what we call academic freedom. And this is one of those big blurry terms that can mean a lot of different things to different people, but it basically boils down to you get to teach in your classroom what you see fit to teach as a professional who has been educated in that field and knows better than the students, probably the administrators, or other stakeholders who might want to come in. Now, sometimes that's not actually the reality, right? I mean, there are plenty of professors teaching various things who let their skills, their knowledge base kind of go to seed. Maybe they're not teaching the cutting edge, best, practices stuff, but at least in theory, academic freedom is supposed to be what tenure provides. But I think part of it is also that issue of continuity. And then we can also talk about, people getting what they're paying for. You brought up a great point. If the school has been saving money for years and years and years by hiring adjuncts, where did all that money go? And that's a valid question. And just to put it in perspective, so I've taught as an adjunct. I was just looking at my teaching career. I've taught in 11 different places over the last 22 years. In one of those, I was a graduate instructor. Okay, so we put that aside because that's just, what you do as a graduate student. And then one of them, I was tenure track, and I was actually up for early tenure and promotion. One I taught for 6 years as non-tenure track, and that's because I was teaching in the prison in the extended education program. But that was full-time. It had benefits, all that nice stuff. And then the other 8 have been as adjuncts. And when you look at what a college course costs at a lot of these places, I tell my students this when I go in. If we have a class of 30 students, one of them is paying for my services. Actually, sometimes one of them is paying for my services and then some other stuff on top of that. The other 29, that money is not going to the professor. Even if you have a full-time professor who is tenured, at best 5 of those 30 students are paying for that professor. So where's all the other money going to? Well, it's administrators and buildings and maybe going into the endowment and, paying staff and building new things. And there's all sorts of initiatives that it might be going into. But the professors are not where the great costs of education lie today.
So I want to go back to something that you said just a moment ago about academic freedom.
Yeah.
Why should the teachers, professors, choose what they want to teach and not the administrators? Aren't the administrators the one that are supposed to set the...
Well, administrators usually don't know anything. I mean, this is one of the dirty little secrets of academia. There's basically 2 kinds of administrators. There's the ones who've risen through the ranks. And so, you become a department chair and then maybe you move on and become an assistant dean and a dean, and you could move up that way, right? And then you could at least plausibly say that you know something about your subject. But let's say we take philosophy, right? So you have to specialize in something, and there's no way that any one person, no matter how smart they are, actually knows the whole field of philosophy. So, if you specialized in Aristotle and you do great work on that, you may not have any idea how I should be teaching Rene Descartes or Mary Wollstonecraft or any of that sort of stuff. So you actually have to respect the expertise, and this is, hopefully they have expertise, of the professors. But then you also have these professional administrators that, at best, have a degree in educational leadership. And there are mills that are just churning these people out, And the dirty little secret of educational leadership is that they don't really learn a lot. They learn some management techniques. They learn some education jargon. They learn a few things about assessment of student learning. And that's about it. They are not qualified to go into a classroom that many of them have never actually been in and say, this person is teaching well or this person is teaching poorly, and they should be teaching Nietzsche better or anything like that. So academic freedom, in part, I'd never thought of it this way. It keeps the administrators from screwing things up more than they already do screw things up.
Huh.
That's a very cynical answer, but
yeah. I guess one extra layer here, but for public institutions.
Yeah.
But what if the state is putting so much money into the higher education? Don't they have some say over what you as professors should be teaching?
Well, they do. And the say is that you should be teaching what you got hired to teach. So if you're hired to teach sociology classes, your peers will evaluate whether you're doing it well. The average person on the street can't walk in and evaluate that any more than they can tell a master electrician what to do. They're not a skilled worker in that respect. And this is where we run into, this is very funny because certain disciplines, people say, oh, I'm a political junkie or I'm a history buff. You might be. But that doesn't mean that you actually know as much as somebody who's actually studied history and written a dissertation where they did historical research or done, political science work quantitatively crunching the numbers after doing polling or something like that, right? And we're willing to accept this in certain areas, and then in other areas, we're a little bit more respectful of experts' expertise, their knowledge base that they've built up. I mean, you wouldn't say, I've watched some popular things about physics. I think I could go in and evaluate what the physics department is doing.
The thing is, like, I've watched Grey's Anatomy. I can totally go and oversee properly the medical department.
Yeah, actually, I mean, this is a whole different topic, right? But we could actually do a whole show on like mistaken conceptions of professional practices that come to us from TV shows. I mean, watching Law and Order does not tell you how to do policing well or courtroom stuff well,
Right. I feel like it's a special version of the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Explain that, because I think maybe some of our listeners don't know what you're referencing.
So Dunning-Kruger are two psychology professors who were doing a number of experiments in which one got coined the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is that the people that are worst at a thing often are the ones that perceive their ability at that thing to be the best. And so the more you know about the thing, the less confident you are that you know the thing well, because it's like, you go into, like, think of whatever speciality that you get into. So, for example, computer science, and you get in there, it's like, okay, I feel good about, like, my first couple courses, and then you get like a year or two in, it's like, oh my gosh, there's like this giant world is now opening up, and you realize how little that you know right now, and you're like, well, I'm not going to be able to investigate 80% of this, hell, maybe even like 95% of this. I'm going to have to really specialize if I want to be at the very bleeding edge of something. And this whole idea is that you're really bad at self-assessing your ability of the thing. And it's actually worse for people that are really good in another field. So doctors have a really bad Dunning-Kruger effect for other disciplines that they don't know about, in part because they have this perception, this correct perception, that they are an expert in something, and thus that transfers somehow to something else.
Now, this is a problem as old as ancient Greece. Socrates, in the Apology, when he's like defending himself pretty poorly, it looks like he's kind of throwing the trial in Plato's Apology, talks about the old adversaries or the old critics that he's got. And what he means by this are people that he's ticked off in the past by showing that they don't actually know what they're talking about. So he went to the politicians, the people who are running things, and he asked them questions, and turns out they just kind of, go by hunches and the seat of their pants. They don't actually know what they're doing. And he goes to the artists, the poets, and turns out they can't actually explain their own poetic productions. And by this we mean cultural productions, like what would be the equivalent of TV shows and movies now, ancient plays. And then he goes to the craftspeople and he says they actually know something. They know their area. And one example of craftspeople from that time are doctors. And it's exactly as you say. They think that because they know something over here and they know it well, and they can produce reliable effects and they can teach it to people, they can do the same with some other totally unrelated area of expertise, and they probably treat it. Like a plumber looks at everything like it's pipes. A doctor looks at everything like it's a medical problem. I suppose a firework maker would look at everything like it's a firework display. I don't know exactly what that would translate into. We'd have to think that through. But this is a long-standing problem. And coming back to the adjunct thing, right? And academic freedom, you don't want people who are unqualified making decisions about what gets taught in the classroom. I said we had good news, bad news about that. So, the bad news is that a lot of the people who should know what they're doing in the classroom don't know what they're doing. So it's, and it can be a lot of people on the tenure track or tenured who just aren't very good at pedagogy. They're not good at teaching, right? They may be great researchers. They may be great grant writers, but they just can't teach to save their life. But some of them actually don't know much about their topics either. You know, you can find that they have got things wrong. So, you know, let's actually jump to this mistaken concern about the quality of instruction. And I think the argument kind of makes sense until you start looking into it. And if you haven't like opened up the can of worms that is academia. And the basic argument is that because the adjuncts are not getting good pay and they're not getting any professional development, we'll talk about what that means in a bit, and because they have to work a lot of hours, students are not going to get the same high quality of instruction from adjuncts as they would be from tenure track faculty, right? So you've got like two different classes of teachers, and it kind of makes sense because if you think about like, let's say you want to get your hair cut, do you go to somebody who owns their own shop and has been cutting hair there and built up a clientele for a decade? Or do you want to go to somebody who rotates from shop to shop to shop and just takes whatever work they can get? You're probably going to get a better haircut from the first person, right? Mm-hmm. So, you know, it kind of makes sense. It's a plausible argument. And there's this interesting reference to a Delphi project in this piece that was published just last year by Alexandra Bradner, The Cruelty of the Adjunct System, where she wrote, scholars of student learning and higher ed from the research-based Delphi project have found that the over-reliance on adjuncts has at least 8 negative effects on student learning, effects that stem largely from reduced contact time and lack of energy for high-impact teaching practices. Now that's interesting, but the reality is that most instructors are not using what we call high-impact teaching practices. It's only a minority who are doing that.
Right, because you don't have to be taught any pedagogy in order to actually be a professor or an adjunct. You just need to know your topic. I've had so many professors who they're probably brilliant. I couldn't tell you if they were because of the way that they were trying to convey this information. Yeah. And I feel like anytime that you become a professor, adjunct or not, you should be like, okay, we're going to give you like continuing education. Go do a theater course or
that would be interesting. Yeah, you know.
Because like part of it is you are standing up there and you are performing. Either you have to make sure that you're enunciating so that people can hear you. You have to command the stage. Need to know how to, hold the presence and the attention of all the people that are there, as well as, a lot of the different techniques that are, I don't know them because I never gone to teaching school, but the pedagogical techniques for actually making sure that people understand the thing that you're trying to do. And if I had to go through one more slideshow where the professor is just reading off the slides in a monotone voice, and where we're going to talk about page 6 today, and you get the point. It is not the way that you want your higher education to be. You should be there going, oh, I get to do all the courses and I learn all the things that I'm so incredibly excited for, and you're stuck with something that is below par.
Yeah, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier. As a student, the whole system is opaque. The best that you can do is look at Rate My Professor and hope that the people who put in the reports weren't too biased when they did so. A lot of times, we know that the same problems with student evaluations show up in Rate My Professor. It's very unscientific, and a lot of times you don't have any idea what the person whose class you're taking is going to be like until you're stuck with them. And you pay the same amount for a good professor as you do for a terrible professor as a student. So this is a big problem. I mean, I will say this. It is true that adjuncts over the long haul are probably not getting to do as much professional development, meaning to go to conferences, to, learn the newest theories or stuff like that as tenure track professors are. This is one of the inequities of it. But the dirty little secret is that many of the tenure track professors don't take advantage of that. And they just get into their position and they keep teaching the same stuff year after year after year with little changes and very little review of their pedagogy and no big incentives to learn more about how to be a better teacher. So, it is a real point, but it's one of those things where good news is you're just as likely to get a bad teacher who is tenured than one who's an adjunct. That's also the bad news, right?
Yeah.
So
there's no current mechanism for trying to either reform or to, weed out those that are bad at that.
Now, this leads to another thing that we have to point out, and this is an epistemological problem. So having to do with knowledge, right? There is no educational system in the United States. And you might say, whoa, wait a second. We have a Department of Education. That's fine, but that doesn't have very much to do at all with how things are different from, say, just here in the Milwaukee area, UW-Milwaukee to Marquette to Mount Mary to Concordia to MSOE to MIAD. These are all different entities, and they all do their different things. And even in the same school, the different departments are doing different things. One department could be great, and the other department could be terrible, and everything in between. And there generally isn't an awful lot of attention to making sure that people are teaching well. I mean, we make sure that they actually show up, but, and we do look at student evaluations, which we know are from, the research that's out there are not reliable for much of anything other than to tell if somebody's really, really bad. But there's no consistency across the board. And I think that a lot of people out there, their minds get boggled by this because of course there has to be a system. And the reality is, in other countries, there is. There is a higher education system. There are consistent standards across Germany. There are consistent standards across France, right? There aren't even here in Milwaukee between the institutions of higher education that we have just in the city limits. And there aren't even, for most of them, in the same school within that university or college, or even sometimes in the department. So that's one of the, again, I mentioned dirty little secrets that you learn from being on the inside. Well, that is one of them. So even with like a state system, like we've got UW, Milwaukee I mentioned, and UW-Madison, and then the next largest is UW-Oshkosh, and then we have, Green Bay and Stout and Whitewater and all that. And I actually take it back with Whitewater, because Whitewater is one of those like tightly focused schools on business, right? Mm-hmm. And Madison has a law school, right? And, Milwaukee has Peck School of the Arts, right? And within particular schools, you might have consistency, but even in a state system, you don't have consistency across the system. So this is a big problem.
But Greg, shouldn't the market just decide this? And
there is effectively no real market. Because in order to have a market, I mean, you could say this, you don't have a market with a capital M, you have a million little individual markets that sometimes respond to each other, and the prices are very, unreliable as to quality, and you can't actually look at the product until you've bought it. So I don't know. Is that a market that could decide?
It's a very opaque market that will not respond to.
Yeah. So
if you can't have any information going into it, then you can't actually make a choice.
Yeah.
A proper choice.
I mean, in a lot of places, you can't even know by looking at the university website what the proportion of adjuncts to tenure track to full-time non-tenure track faculty is. Sometimes the adjuncts aren't even on the university website, right? I've taught places where I'm essentially a ghost. And in other cases, the adjuncts will be treated almost as if they are full-time faculty. They'll have big web pages and stuff like that. And you have no idea that what you're dealing with are a whole bunch of adjuncts with one chair of a department. I won't say which school it is, whose philosophy and a couple other departments around here are like that. I'll just say that there is one within the greater Milwaukee area which is like that.
Well, I assume that you've got like NDAs and whatnot that prevent you from talking about.
No, I just don't want to badmouth anybody.
Okay.
And I don't want to give the impression that just hiring adjuncts is necessarily bad, because we can't tell the quality of education in general. So I don't want people to, look down on that institution for essentially farming out almost all of the work to adjuncts. I will say this, that school has made a devil's bargain, because that money that's saved by hiring more and more adjuncts, that money just gets essentially thrown away on whatever it is the administrators decide to funnel the money into, and you never get that money back. So, a lot of people would say, oh, well, why don't we just fix things? Just let's take the adjuncts and give them job security and raise their income. And we'll talk about what the actual income of adjuncts is in a minute, so you'll get an idea about why this is such an issue. That money isn't available anymore. Mm-hmm. It's been essentially thrown away. So
but don't you need a lazy river?
Yeah, imagine that you had a business, right? And what they did is they cut everybody's benefits and wages or salary down to a third to a quarter of what it was, and then they just held a bunch of parties. No. You're never getting that money back, right?
Right.
So, I mean, how much are adjuncts making? Let's talk, as they say, turkey, right? So it can
never
go
got
as low.
That.
What's that?
I never figured that one out. That idiom.
I don't know what the origin of that is either, frankly.
Huh. Frankly or Franklin? I know that he was big on the turkey.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, it could have something to do with him.
Could be.
So adjuncts, right? This is where it gets, again, very interesting as well. So if you look out there and you just Google adjunct salaries or adjuncts wages, you can find a lot of incorrect information. So I'll tell you about some of that I found just Googling. And it's irresponsibly wrong, right? It gives people totally incorrect ideas about adjunct salaries. So Zippia says the average adjunct professor salary in Wisconsin is $86,000. The average professor tenured salary in Wisconsin is not $86,000. It's way lower than that, So they then said that adjunct professor salaries in Wisconsin range between $42,000 and $175,000 a year. There's nobody who's making $175,000 a year as an adjunct, and there's very few who are making $42,000 as adjuncts. Indeed said that the national average salary for an adjunct professor is $123,000. Most professors, tenured, are not making remotely close to that. So there's no way adjuncts are getting anywhere near that. Glassdoor is a little bit more realistic, saying that they make $119,000 a year. I mean, it sounds like good money, right? But it's still la-la land. Adjuncts don't get salaries to begin with. So you know that information's wrong. And if they did, these would be totally high. What do you get? If you're an adjunct, you don't have any benefits. You don't get health insurance. You don't get retirement. So we don't count any of that sort of money in there. It starts at about $1,800 a class. I actually had somebody, a friend of mine, offer me a class at $1,800 recently. Now, that is for an entire semester. That's teaching 3 credits. $1,800 a class. That's really low. It can go lower than that. Some places pay pretty decently. They might pay $8,000, $10,000. University of Notre Dame does good by its adjuncts. Places on the East Coast have to pay more because things cost more. But the average is in the $2,500 to $3,000 range. So imagine, so this is for a year. How many classes would you need to teach in order to make, say, $30,000? You need to teach 10 classes. Now that's more than a full-time load. And that's if you can find 10 classes. So adjuncts are, we call it the gig economy. It's the same sort of thing as happening to people who work for Uber or Eat Street. They are not getting paid well at all. And this, you're required to meet with your classes, hold office hours, all of that sort of stuff. Sometimes unionization can raise adjunct wages, but that's if you're in a state that is receptive to unions. The graduate students at Marquette and adjuncts were trying to unionize before COVID hit. It takes years to get a union in place. And then you have to do the collective bargaining. So adjuncts are not making much money at all. And this is where, a sort of inequity sets in, right?
You're at the price, you're basically on the edge. You're not living a good life.
That's right.
You're barely making more than just poverty line. And these are supposed to be good jobs that are like trying to be, if your parents, these are the people that your kids are being taught by, or that these are your professors. That just doesn't seem right.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to say, so there are adjuncts who are in somewhat different circumstances, and I'm one of them. I have my own business, right? Mm-hmm. If I had to make it just as an adjunct, I'd just be eating beans and rice all the time, because that's all I could afford. And I sure wouldn't be living here in the downtown of Milwaukee. I'd have to live way the hell out in the middle of nowhere, because rent is expensive. And I make more with my business than I do teaching. And so I'm what you call a working professional. There's like lawyers who will teach a class here and there in the law school, and, people who are kind of moonlighting, right? And then there's spousal hires. Your spouse has a good job at the university and you get hired to teach a class here and there. That's not too bad, right? Sometimes there's people who have other education-related work, like they might be teaching in the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, and then they also teach a class on the side, or they're an administrator who teaches. And then, grad students who are teaching as adjuncts. I did that. I worked at a community college while I was a graduate student to get some teaching experience. And you're a graduate student, so you're used to having no money anyway. It's not a big deal, right? But the bulk of adjuncts are people who are trying to make a living teaching as adjuncts at multiple institutions. And some people are teaching at 4 or 5 different places every semester and going from one to the other to the other. And you can only really do that in places where there's lots of schools, So that's a miserable life. And that'll wear on you,
Yeah. Thankfully, I guess Milwaukee has a number of institutions. It really only works at least partially if you have a high density. Like Boston has an incredible.
That's right.
number.
Yeah. New York is another place where many people will teach. I mean, my wife, she's taught massive teaching loads as an adjunct in the past. Going from one institution to the next, and, basically just, that's all she did. So, yeah. So there's a lot of people trying to make it, and it's, like you said, it's not really a life. It's not a good life.
No.
But it's sold as, and so here's where we get into some of the the other problems with being an adjunct. And these are ethical problems, right? So one of the ways that I've seen a lot of people, and I've actually fallen into this myself, get suckered, is they hire you as an adjunct and they're like, if a full-time position ever comes open in the department, you are going to be a shoo-in. And so many of my fellow graduates, I saw this happen. They could teach at an institution, a full-time position comes open, they don't even get considered for it. Because if you're an adjunct, there's this presumption that, well, you couldn't cut it. You weren't as good. Why would we hire you to bring you in to do things? And so this is something that's really demoralizing. And I found this interesting discussion in this book, The Adjunct Underclass by Herb Childress, calling adjunct labor hope labor. And hope labor is or undercompensated work carried out in the present, often for experience or exposure, in the hope that future employment opportunities may follow. And then, for many adjuncts, that hope comes to nothing. You're good enough to be the help. You're not good enough to have a stake or a place at the table in the department. And I think this is something that a lot of people have, unfortunately, been suckered into. And they only really learn that they were taken advantage of when they don't get an interview for a position that they're, for the very classes that they've been teaching for that institution, they won't get considered for a full-time position.
This is just like the constant desire for the new shinies. Like, oh, there's got to be some new up-and-coming grad student there. We want to give that position to them, not like the guy who's been doing the work.
Yeah, that'll really stick it when you see somebody that we call ABD, all but dissertation, getting hired with little teaching experience for the full-time position, and you stay in the adjunct role. I mean, these are the sort of things that over time they wear a lot of adjuncts down. And there's sort of a sign of contempt, a sign that you're being exploited. Mm-hmm. So I think this should be viewed as an ethical problem, Another thing that can happen, I've actually had this happen to me, is having the classes that you develop and teach get poached by full-timers who are like, oh, I like that. I'll do that instead. So, you might develop a great online class and then they're like, that looks like a cool class I'd like to teach, and now you're not teaching it anymore. Another sign that you kind of don't matter to the department, And again, they may teach it worse than you as the adjunct teach it. You also have to scramble every semester to try to find work. I will say, so I don't want to talk about any place and badmouth them. Mm-hmm. I will say that one place that I do teach, Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, is very good to the adjuncts and make sure that we do have reliable work semester after semester after semester. It's not that way in most other places where you might not actually know whether you have a class until weeks before the semester begins, And, I think when we hear about this stuff, we should think about, well, what would this be like in other industries? Could you get away with doing this sort of thing? Like, could you have a company where you have somebody doing part-time work, doing good part-time work, and then you pass them over for, like you said, the kid who comes in, doesn't have any experience, but maybe has connections? Would that be viewed as offensive, right?
Most likely. And you're definitely not going to get any place that, like, needs people all the time. Like, if you're, even going from flipping burgers to, working at some place that's much more, intellectually difficult.
Yeah.
If they have to be there every day, then that's just not how it usually works. You see this a lot more in the gig economies, but those are like, it's only there because you've got some sort of weird algorithm set up, because otherwise it would take way too much time to be constantly doing this, and only because you've only got to look for, if you're a department, you're looking to fill 20 classes or 10 classes in your department per semester?
Well, it depends on how big your school is, right? Yeah. So, like, if you're thinking about a small liberal arts college, it will depend on the department too. So, like, if we're talking about philosophy, probably not that many classes, right? If you're talking about writing and writing adjuncts, holy crap, do they work their butts off? Because, with philosophy, we got to go in and talk to the students and put some stuff on the board and answer some questions and try to get them to read some text and, do some, exercises with them, make sure they have to do some, tests and essays and things like that. If you're a writing instructor, you're looking at student papers every single week and giving them feedback on that. You're spending at least twice as much time as a philosophy or history or, a science instructor would be. And there are big writing departments because every single student has to take some writing classes,
Right. Yes. It only works in this thing because you have these jobs that are several months at a time. You only have to do that like twice or three times a year, depending on your schedule.
Right.
If any other organization did that for usually the amount of employees that they're going to have, that would be rather impractical.
I mean, the analogy that comes to mind right away, and it's not a great one, would be the seasonal kind of things like selling Christmas trees, on a Christmas tree lot or pumpkin farms, right? Or seasonal employees in department stores. I mean, what else would be like that?
Yeah, but the pool of employees for an adjunct position is going to be considerably smaller than the pool of employees for selling Christmas trees.
That's right, because more skills are required, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so, like, there's one thing where you have an abundance of, potential hires versus a much narrower. Like, I've done hiring. It sucks. It takes so much time. You have
to figure out who's lying to you and who's not.
Yeah, there's all this stuff, and to be constantly doing that every year, like, of course the administration costs are going up. They're doing, like, years worth of in hiring all the time. It's terrible.
Well, to be fair, it's usually the department chairs that are stuck hiring the adjuncts rather than like the deans and people like that. The deans sign off on everything, right? The deans they say, you get to hire this number of people, but it's the department chairs who have to like reach out and say, hey, are you available? We just had 5 sections open up. Can you take 3 of them? They have to do that sort of work. And department chairs are usually people who've risen from the faculty. So, some of them are doing it just because they get a salary bump or a course release. Some of them are doing it because they're like motivated by if I'm not chair, this person who's even worse at it than me will step in and be the chair, right? So a lot of them are not particularly into hiring people and stuff like that.
What is a course release?
Oh, so like let's say your normal teaching load would be teaching 3 classes per semester. So a course release means that you, for the same amount of money, you only have to teach 2 classes per semester because you're compensating by doing additional needed work. Like you could actually get a course release to work on research projects that you apply for or doing some other service to the academic institution. So being a chair, it's a lot of work. Yeah. And it makes sense that they get course releases, I think.
So, do we have any other potential solutions that you haven't talked about? You talked about like the unionization thing.
Well, I think that a lot of the solutions that are proposed turn out to be impractical. A lot of times people will be like, see, and that's exactly why you need a union. But it's really tough to put a union into place, in a state like Wisconsin, for example. It's easier, and it would be even tougher like in a southern state. But it's easier out on the East Coast or in California, but it's not really a solution here. By the time that adjuncts would organize and get a union, a couple of years would have passed, right? And if you're just going from semester to semester, that's not really helpful. You also, you get a lot of foolish advice, sort of like how people give you foolish medical advice when they're not doctors. Another thing is they'll say, well, schools should stop producing so many PhDs. Well, how the hell are we going to do that? You're going to put a chokehold on it and say each school gets to graduate 2 philosophy PhDs per year or something. Who's going to actually make that happen? There's no system that would govern that. Telling them, have you tried a side hustle like delivering pizzas or Uber or Lyft? That's not very helpful advice because they're already gigging as an adjunct, right? I actually, there was a great comment. So I put out a call for comments in social media, and one that I could really relate to. So this is from Twitter, and it was from Ashmare. Most people have no clue that teaching college has become so gigified. My family thought you just work your way up the ladder like anything else and didn't get it. And then another person said something like, can't you just go into an office and say, can you give me a full-time job? I'm ready to work. I'm happy to do it. And my family was like that, when I was teaching. Now, when I was teaching at full time, right, I was teaching at Indiana State Prison, teaching for Ball State University. And they're like, Purdue is just down the road from you. Why don't you drive down there and go into the philosophy department office and talk to the chair and see if they've got a job for you? And you'd be like, that ain't how it works, man. There's a whole hiring process where you got to put together this massive portfolio, and then you're one of 500 applicants, and maybe you get an interview, and then you go on from there and all that. And I think a lot of people just don't get it. And so there isn't any easy solution to this. I suppose the thing you could say is, as individuals, let's just be better to people that we know are adjuncts. Let's not look down on them. Let's not treat them as if they deserve this, maybe take them out to lunch or something like that. I don't know. What do you have any ideas?
I don't know. Make it easier for unions.
Well, that would be something we could do. Yeah. I mean, but then we're talking 5-10 years down the line. Right.
But elect people that make that easier. At least that's something.
Yeah. That could be a good solution. Not an immediate solution.
No. But yeah, toss a coin to your adjunct.
There you go. Yeah.
Can we get a tip jar for you, Greg?
Well, I would rather see it go to adjuncts who need it much more than I do.
So maybe an adjunct fund. It's whenever someone needs, hey, I've got medical bills. Yeah, do that. But
when you see people in social media putting out calls for that sort of stuff, mutual aid, it's often called, maybe contribute to it. So yeah. But we're almost out of time. Do you want to lead us out on a final thought?
We leave you with the words of Alexandra Bradner. The adjunct system is immoral by any philosophical measure.